everybody. Salutations in Christ. This is the Three Arms Podcast, where we engage in ecumenical dialogue about current Christian events, theology, exposing heresy, promoting orthodoxy, and hopefully bringing clarity and unity to the body. We are happy to have you all as listeners. Keep us in your prayers and enjoy the episode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Three Arms Podcast. We're back at it again. Today, Evelyne and I are doing a two-arm chat about Christian themes in secular media.
Yes, guys, so we are finally back. It's been a little while. Today, we are down an arm, as you notice. Carol has just started at his new college and is absolutely swamped, but he will be back soon. Carol, if you're listening to this, we miss you and we wish you well on your academic journey. This is kind of a bit of an impromptu episode because we were discussing what to talk about basically, I think 10, maybe 15 minutes before we sat down to record this episode. And we had some general ideas, some things we wanted to go over, some bigger projects that require Carol to be present. And so we kind of settled on this as we were having a conversation about some films and books we have enjoyed that we felt had some interesting messaging with religious implications. One of the most common examples you can find of a more secular piece of art or media that has religious overtones or themes would be The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, which, as we know, is a fantasy series that he did write with the intention of it having religious overtones, despite it being advertised to children in a secular audience. And then, of course, The Lord of the Rings, also written by another theologian of the same time period, based on his World War II experience, that also has some religious themes based on his personal belief system. But Thaddeus, what are some more modern or perhaps more relevant pieces of media that you feel like you've interacted with that are marketed as secular or are secular that have religious overtones and Christian messaging generally?
I don't know how much about Christian messaging you could say, but I think the most prevalent and perhaps the most obvious route to take this one, the Dune series came back in mainstream media despite the books coming out. I think it was like 1974, but it's like a painting on the pros and cons of religious belief. I really liked it, despite being a Christian myself. It kind of like warns against, organized religion and prophet figures, Messiah figures.
I think Dune is a great example of a piece of media that has come back to relevancy in recent times, despite it not necessarily being a pretty reflection of organized religion. I do think it has a lot for Christians to learn from in regards to the way he sort of warns against those religious extremist beliefs, especially in an era where we have, at least in Protestant circles, things like the prosperity gospel, which I think most people will be familiar with, but if you're not, it is a theological heresy and series of principles that sort of warps the messaging of the gospel to be very focused on success, primarily financial and material in this life as being a intention of God for us all in this life. It's kind of the message that God only wants good things for people. He wants you to be rich. He wants you to be healthy. He wants you to be a prominent figure in society. There's a lot of different ways that this sort of philosophy can go and take you, and some are more extreme than others. You find that a lot of these pastors who preach this sort of messaging do so in a way that benefits them primarily. So it can kind of look like them asking their congregation to fund their lifestyle or bless the church or give a gift so that they can sow a seed to reap benefits in their own life, primarily financial seeds. As strange as it sounds in a way, the character of Paul utilizing his position as being viewed as this Messiah savior who connects them to their God and is basically going to bring them to salvation is a reflection also of the way that humans can hold on to a pastor figure or a cult leader and can be led astray from the true gospel. So I think that that's an interesting point. Thaddeus, what do you have to say to that? Do you feel like in the Orthodox circle you guys have these sort of false prophet figures rise up at times and try to take control?
Yeah, I have to find this guy's name, but there's this priest of questionable authenticity in his priesthood. His name is Father Peter Heers. He's been sprouting more I don't want to quite say radical, but they're very, very different from the messaging put out by the general Orthodox Church. He tends to be more traditional. The standard Orthobro kind of flocks to him as like a return to sacred ancient Christianity, which maybe I'm real skeptical, especially because he doesn't have his own church. He's kind of just a floating priest. Aside from that, I'm not too aware, but I think the story of Dune can kind of be a way of showing Christians how putting too much blind faith into the organization can lead to some pretty disastrous consequences. Because in Dune, if you read the books or you paid attention to the movies, it's basically said that no one can survive in the desert without faith, which is kind of how Christianity is. No one can really live in the world and thrive truly without believing in Christ. And so if you take that away from the people, then they would kind of just wither and die. But then if you take it to such a blind level and you put someone who is willing to move in and kind of take advantage of the situation, then you really got to watch out for that. And I think it's a good way of kind of showing us how in some instances we've been blind to, I guess, corruption, because no organization is without corruption. I think we can all say that pretty objectively, no matter how much we love our bishops or pastors or popes or patriarchs or all of that. There is always some level of corruption. So I think Dune is a good way of saying you need to keep your faith but not let it blind you in a really grand storytelling.
I think that's a really good point that you made, Thaddeus. I've definitely seen that happen in the Protestant circles. Good grief, we have so many scandals on a regular basis. I can't count the number of times I open my phone and I see another headline and it's like, Pastor so-and-so of such and such church in so-and-so area did A, B, C, D, E, F, or G, or all of those letters for that matter. And, the church people are just shocked by it. But, there's always those voices that come out afterwards or in the interviews that say, well, actually, we tried to bring this to the awareness of the congregation. They weren't willing to hear about it. We tried to go to leadership. They weren't willing to hear about it. And it kind of reminds me of Zendaya's character in Dune trying to tell them not to look at Paul as basically this godlike figure because it was going to lead to disaster. And I feel like I completely agree with what you're saying. It's keep your faith, but don't let it blind you.
I find that interesting that you bring up Zendaya's character. Her name is Chani. This is kind of going into spoilers territory. So in the books, Chani's character actually kind of supports Paul. At the end of the first book, Chani does not leave Paul. At the end of the first book, she stays. And there's this really epic line at the end of the book from Lady Jessica to Chani about being a wife and how they're not actually going to be wives, but blah, blah, blah. It's a really good line. If you get to the end of the book, you'll know which line I'm talking about. I think it was actually a good move on the filmmakers to change Chani's character to bring out that message. Because in the books, you can kind of just see what's going on and still get the message. But with the movies, I feel like maybe if you were to keep Chani's character the same, then you kind of don't have a voice of reason, and then everyone is just a blind follower to this religion.
I think you're right. I think there's something about the transfer from book to film where when you're reading or writing a book, because I am a writer, you can show the readers a lot through the actions and reactions of people and through your narration. Do you know what person the book is written in?
It's
clarify.
Third person omnipotent.
Third person omniscient?
No, it's third person, forget the name, it's third person character. And most of the time it's through Paul, but maybe halfway through a chapter, you'll move over to the Baron or another character and you'll see it through their eyes.
When you have a story told that way of the different perspectives, you can kind of show the reader their inner thought process. And so the reader can sort of make decisions on how to respond to the way the person is thinking better. Whereas with a movie, you can't show that stream of consciousness as clearly. So it's important to bring in characters to sort of show the way you're supposed to be interpreting the story and how it's going, if that makes sense.
I think the choice to change Chani's character to more of a voice of reason for the audience highlighted what Frank Herbert was trying to get across with Dune's primary message.
When we think of that in the Christian context, who are the figures, I guess you would say, are people who you would feel play the role of more of Chani's character being that voice of reason?
Kind of stealing from my patron saint here, if you ever read the book of Jude, it's a really short book, I think it's only 25 verses. But anyway, warns about false prophets, false preachers. And I think Chani's character kind of fits that mold where she's like, this guy isn't really who you think he is. Be careful of that. If you wanted to argue that Paul was the good guy in Dune, you could also argue that Chani is like the Pharisees because they didn't believe that Jesus was the true prophet. If you wanted to put like a crazy spin on the message of Dune.
I can see that,
Yeah.
actually. That's an interesting observation. The Pharisees and Shawnee being an unbeliever, at least in the film, is an interesting comparison. Although I think the Pharisees and Shawnee would be different in that Shawnee really doesn't believe in anything in the films, and the Pharisees believed that they were
Yeah.
upholding orthodoxy.
It's not like a one-to-one comparison. I guess you could say Chani is like the Pharisees of like modern society. They're like, no, all religion is false. You guys are going crazy. We don't fight for religion. We fight for the betterment of human society or for science or for whatever, which aren't necessarily bad things to fight for. It's actually a really funny twist on it if you look at it from that perspective. I think a more one-to-one comparison is kind of the same message that you get from the book of Jude, where it's like warning against false prophets, false teachers, not to be swept away by the ideals that contradict what Jesus has preached, who preach for themselves. That's also what the book of Jude warns against. Because if you look at Paul, like Paul doesn't fight for the betterment of the Fremen. He fights for the betterment of himself and his own goals. It's a selfish motive. And so the book of Jude is kind of warning against teachers who teach for their own gain, for their own benefit, instead of the benefit of the flock and the salvation of others.
I think there is something about the relationship Paul has with the Fremen that is very similar to that of the one that Jesus had with the disciples in a way. But it's a little bit different though, because the Fremen kind of adopt Paul instead of Paul calling the Fremen, if that makes sense. Whereas we know in the Gospels, Jesus literally went up and was like, y'all are coming with me. And they're like, okay, guess we're leaving everything behind. Nothing else to do.
Adios, mother. Adios, father. Have
Exactly.
fun dying in old age without me.
Or they left their spouses too. A couple of them had spouses. Interesting, although they
That's
didn't go
true.
back to them.
Although, fun fact real quick, we're pretty sure John, like St. John, was like a teenager when he was called to Christ. Like he's definitely the youngest of the apostles. Like from a pure history kind of standpoint, the current theory is that he was like probably like 18, somewhere around there. So I don't know. That was something that I saw recently. Don't know how true it is. Don't know how much historical validity that is because I haven't looked into it.
If you want to get into some other like spiritual aspects of the story, I guess spiritual warfare in Dune would be an interesting way to look at it, because you have in Christianity that a lot of things go on in the spiritual realm that affect us in the physical. And in
Yeah.
Dune, you have the Bene Gesserit organization working behind the scenes and pulling all of the strings.
Yeah.
And
True.
so, in that way, there is some overlap with those concepts.
Although in the story of Dune, the Bene Gesserit is also a selfish organization. They work for their belief that they can produce like basically like the perfect person instead of having the perfect person be given unto them by the grace of God.
That is a good point. So, I
I
guess
feel
they would be more of the devil than they would be on Christ's side of things.
I feel like all of the important figures in Dune are kind of like the reverse of what they are in the Bible. Like Paul is the Messiah, but he's the selfish Messiah. The Bene Gesserit are spiritual powers, but they're bad spiritual powers. And Chani kind of like is like a reverse Pharisee. You know, maybe Carol was right when he said Paul was the Antichrist. He said that to me once. Carol was talking to me about this subject like a while ago, and he said that his brother had posited the theory that Dune is like about the origin of the Antichrist in fiction. It's not what Frank Herbert was going for, but it's definitely like an interesting way to kind of look at the book series.
Yeah, I remember when researching Frank Herbert, he had taken a lot of inspiration from Abrahamic religions generally. Abrahamic religions
Yeah,
being Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. I know he took a lot of inspiration from Islam specifically, but as we know, there's a lot of interesting overlap with the three religions. In
yeah,
Christianity, we have Jesus as the Son of God, and in Islam, Jesus is a prophet. And so a lot of the characters that are in Christianity are also going to be in Islam, but just differently, of course. And I'm not,
yeah.
by making that statement, I do want to clarify, I'm not advocating for a universalist view that all roads lead to God. That is not what I'm saying. Nor do I wish to disrespect anybody who is Muslim or of an Islamic background. I really, despite living in 2 different Islamic countries, don't really know that much beyond the general principles of Islam. So I can't speak on that at all. But I will say that all the
Yeah.
Muslims I've ever met have been extremely, extremely nice. So there is that.
And I guess you could also kind of compare the Fremen to the Jews, because the Jews are waiting for their Messiah, just like the Fremen are.
Maybe we could look a little bit at Paul's journey through suffering and how that leads him to sort of his calling and vocation, as Carol posited, the Antichrist. I think one thing that was very interesting with the film, at least, was how they portrayed how the mother character influences her son. Lady Jessica, she, in the first movie, takes on this very seemingly innocent, more kind.
Passive almost.
Yes. And then in the second, she's more transparent about what her objectives are.
And by the time the second film comes around, like, the Lady Jessica's already played her checkmate. Like, there's nothing Paul can really do about it at this point. And that's kind of what she was hoping for in the first film, was kind of just that, like, silent watching over Paul until she could kind of just push him in the right direction.
You know, the Bible talks a lot about the type of company you keep. I guess you could say the type of people you surround yourself with. And it does make one consider whether or not the people you surround yourself with really have your best intentions at heart, or whether they
Yeah.
have motives to lead you down a certain path subtly, oftentimes, that is going to lead to destruction and the harm of other people.
When you go back and you watch the first film after watching the second one, you realize that the choice for Jessica to have a son was like it was a choice. Like, she chose to have a son, knowing in her heart that she could bring about Paul and everything that Paul was going to do. Low-key, everything might be Lady Jessica's fault.
Yes, and it's interesting because she wasn't married to Paul's father.
I don't think they married because the Duke wanted to remain kind of like a quote-unquote a suitor to attract political allies. I think it was.
Oh, that makes sense.
He had no intention of marrying anyone else but Jessica, but he just didn't ever get the chance to, because whoop-de-doo, he dies.
I mean, it's almost like a Samson and Delilah situation a little bit. I don't know if you see those overtones to it, but
A little bit.
yeah, it's a little unnerving.
Once the Atreides get their assignment to Arrakis, like, they know that the doom is happening. But Jessica kind of knew that the Duke was gonna have to die, even before they had to move. Which is really unsettling when you consider the fact that she loved the Duke, and yet she still is willing to kind of just throw him under the bus for Paul and his inevitable rise to power.
Yes, because she has the gift of foresight as well, so she probably would have foreseen exactly how he would have died as well, knowing he would suffer. I mean, I
Yeah.
suppose being of the sect of women that she's from, she would have been prepared to sacrifice him for the greater purpose of their organization. And so, for that reason, no matter how much she loves him, the vision trumps the.
Personal attachment.
Exactly. And it is very Samson and Delilah-esque, or like the woman mentioned in Proverbs to avoid, that Solomon is constantly saying, avoid this one. Don't fall into her snare. Which, I mean,
Yeah.
you're not necessarily supposed to take it that literally because, you know, people can get very extreme.
Yeah. Just a little bit. Just a little extreme.
Just a little bit. But, you know, that's an example. Since we're on the subject of Dune, I think another one we can pivot to, which has actually been accused of basically ripping off Dune, and did, by the way, is Star Wars, which I think is one that people will definitely be a lot more familiar with.
In modern Star Wars, you have a lot of, like, what is the dark side and what is the light side? They can coexist. But if you look at the original Star Wars, there's selfish people who are the Sith, and you have selfless people who are the Jedi, and you can't have an overlap, because then if you have selflessness in the Sith, that's just being a Jedi, and if you have selfishness in the Jedi, that's just being a Sith, and it gets really confusing. And I always felt like that dichotomy of selflessness and selfishness was such an important keystone of Star Wars. You can trace that all the way back to kind of like the Christian morality, because that's kind of the world that George Lucas grew up in, was 1960s, 1970s Protestant America. And I think it's important to note you can't be selfless and selfish at the same time. If you try to do both, you're just going to be selfish at the end of the day. And I feel like we should bring that narrative back of selflessness being awesome and super cool.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. There is definitely something to be said about the difference between the two series, even though they're technically one series. Fun fact, George Lucas is actually from my hometown, and his sister still lives there.
Really?
There's a statue of him in Modesto, California, because he grew up there. Thinking about what you said about 1970 America and thinking about the town he would have grown up in, and sort of him always developing the ideas for Star Wars while he was a kid and into teenage years and as an adult, and taking so much inspiration from Dune and, different sci-fi things that were going on at the time. I do find some of the religious tones, I wonder how overt or purposeful they were. Just because Modesto is kind of I wouldn't say it's a very Christian town, but it's an overgrown farming town. So there's a very, very large religious presence. And we have people who have never left California who basically have the equivalent of Southern accents, which is fascinating.
Y'all.
Oh, yeah. Country music is big in my hometown. Listen, you would not know we were not a Southern town if you didn't know that we were in the state of California. I'm just going to be honest. You wouldn't know. I don't really know why that is, though. I never lived there long enough to really understand the intricacies of why my town is the way it is.
We should do an experiment where we just keep an American town bottled up to see if being isolated in America just naturally gives you a Southern accent. What you had brought up about like how intentional the religious aspect of Star Wars is kind of interesting to think about. Like, how much did George Lucas like actually think about having a religious message in Star Wars, and how much of it was just a product of its time when like everyone in America was still Protestant or Christian in some capacity?
Yes, I would say in the 70s around there, it's interesting because it was a transitional era in America as far as religion was viewed by the youth. But yes, there was a general cultural Christianity, I think, and I would fully agree with that pretty much. When I think about Star Wars' religious aspect, obviously, I think the most prominent concept is the Force, which in a way kind of reflects the deist interpretation of the role of the Christian God, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because it's the idea that there's a spiritual force that has purpose but is not personal. There is some enlightenment overtones to that, but I'm not entirely sure that that was intentional. And then there are the concepts of the way that evil and good kind of interact with the world and people, and the idea of the butterfly effect, how small choices change the course of humans, or in this case, these, I don't know if you would call them aliens, but these beings' lives. There's just a lot there to unpack, I suppose. I just find it very, very interesting. I do feel like there's a lot more sort of New Age and Buddhist overtones and Hindu overtones to a lot of the concepts in Star Wars, simply because I feel like, the idea of joining the Force, and then you have Nirvana, which is basically dying and becoming part of the wider universe. You don't have the concept in Star Wars so much of living multiple lives, though.
Is there still like the Force Ghost reincarnation thing?
Yes.
Which, like, depending on which Star Wars movie you watch, has a different interpretation of how Force Ghosts work. Because if you watch the original trilogy, they kind of just stand there and maybe have conversations with you. But then if you watch, like, the sequel trilogy, they can, like, pick up objects and, like, alter the physical realm. So I guess it just depends on which movie you watch. But overall, the concept, you're right, is kind of the same, where they've come to peace with the Force and then they can join it and manifest after death, and kind of immortality in that sense.
Yes, and the idea of the afterlife in Dune and in Star Wars is so interesting just to think of in comparison to the Christian one, because obviously in the Christian worldview, right, we don't believe in coming back from the dead in that way. In the Old Testament, there is very specific instruction about not trying to interact with the dead. And in the Protestant circle of things, we have many people who believe that there are spiritual beings such as demons who can impersonate dead relatives, and that is a reason why you should not try to, which I don't know the validity of that argument theologically at all.
I find that hard to believe. It seems like a lot of effort. They can like manifest themselves as an angel of the light. I know that's a thing. That's expressly stated, I think, in one of Paul's letters. I don't know about dead family relatives. I haven't heard anything about that.
Some people have reported instances of seeing dead relatives walking through their house or standing at the foot of their bed and that sort of thing. And so I think people naturally, there are elements of the supernatural we're not meant to understand. And this is an area that I try to avoid in Protestantism because I just feel like it's so much speculation, if that makes sense. And it gets really,
Yeah,
really
no,
weird really fast, and
yeah.
it just gets creepy.
And there's also, you have to deal with the perception of time and like how does that work for dead people? Because we know God is eternal, so he's like outside of time. So if you go to heaven, or if you go to hell for that matter, like are you in hell right now, or are you going to be in hell later? Because when you die, like it's just like you go outside of time with God into heaven or hell. Like I don't know, it's really weird. I'm real skeptical about ghosts, phantoms, apparitions. I'm more inclined to think that they were like smoking something than that they actually saw it.
I mean, there is that occasion that does happen, where people are on drugs. That's another thing that's interesting in religious circles in Protestantism, is that generally we're opposed to weed or all of that sort of stuff because there's some sects that believe it opens doors to being terrorized basically by spiritual beings, which it very well could, because the Bible does talk about the importance of being sober minded for the Christian walk and avoiding encountering and trying to go beyond what we are relegated in when we are sober.
Yeah.
And I mean, I suppose in theory, it's not completely out of principle that demons can do things that are beyond sort of our understanding of them simply because of the Old Testament. There's angels who appear as human beings, and demons are just fallen
Yeah.
angels. So I suppose, in a sense, that yes, a demon could enter.
If you were to logically conclude. I've no doubt that demons exist and that they can do stuff. My priest said this to me once. Demons no longer have to take physical forms to get what they want. They can use basically the things that we've created. I guess the most obvious example, and people are going to roll their eyes, like social media and like just the widespread public media in general. Demons, they are real and they can manifest. It's just not as common anymore because they don't need to. They can manipulate you in easier, more effective methods.
I would agree with that. It would throw things off a little bit, I think. At least in the Western world, I do feel that spiritual happenings seem to be less common, whereas I know in places like India, I mean, it's not necessarily an everyday occurrence, but it's certainly not all that
Out of the realm of
uncommon.
possibility.
Because I mean, I've even had weird things happen while I'm there where it's like, not things jump out at you, but you feel a certain degree of spiritual oppression you don't necessarily feel in the West. But there's a different type of spiritual oppression in the West that you also feel very keenly. That's also very disturbing because it's like a haze in America. I noticed that when I was in America, I felt like I was constantly in a daze or sort of disconnected from the rest of the world because America's America and it's far away from everything else that's going on in the world. And so it just feels very much like you don't have to worry about the rest of the world's problems because that doesn't really affect us directly, if that makes sense. And so it kind of brings a sort of sleepiness, I think. And so I think the enemy works more effectively in America also through, like you were saying, other means because people are less likely to believe in spiritual anything nowadays in the Western context, which can be for any number of reasons, really. I think there are some valid reasons why I've heard people argue that they are atheists, and that's probably a shocking thing to say as a Christian, but I just think primarily it comes from a misunderstanding of what Christianity is.
I don't know. I feel like that was pretty much everything I had to say. But what was that one movie, TV, book series that you were talking about?
One Day. Yeah.
One Day. Right.
So One Day is a book by David Nichols, and it follows Emma Morley and Dexter Mayhew basically on their last day of college and their graduation day all the way up till they're in their 40s. And she has passed away due to an accident. And it's just the story of the way that people's choices can change how much time they get to spend with people they really care about. Because sort of Dexter Mayhew's character is a very aimless, I would say, sort of character where he's quite self-centered. And I think as we were talking about selfishness during our short, brief touch on Star Wars, there's a lot of that concept that Dexter's selfishness keeps him from being able to really come into who he's meant to be, in the sense that he doesn't really mature. He kind of stays very immature in the way he handles things, and he's kind of emotionally stunted a little bit. He has to rely on relationships to basically have any sort of life stability. He's constantly dealing with substance abuse and just really struggles to sort of finally get to the point where he can be with the woman he really loves, and then their years are robbed because she ends up having this horrible accident. And it's also really sad because it takes her forever to kind of figure out what she's really meant to do with her life, and she's just starting to get to the point where she's happy with who she is and where she's at in life, and then she dies. So I think it's also just the concept that the world is not fair, right? Which is something Christianity we're taught.
Yeah.
But really, it's also that concept that we aren't promised tomorrow, and so we should make the most of today. And in the Bible, there's a verse that talks about do not boast in tomorrow, for we do not know what tomorrow will bring. And in light of Revelation, which tells us, or the Gospels, it actually might be in the Gospels originally, and then it's quoted in Revelation, that no one knows the day or the hour in which Christ will return. And when he does, there will be kind of no time to turn things around, basically. It's just a good reminder to be mindful of the time and space we're given, and to use it wisely, and to always be alert in the way that we are acting and we are treating others.
And I was just going to tie it into the parable about that one dude, and he owns like a farm, and he gets a really good harvest. So he's like, well, now I need to store everything. Oops, I can't store everything. Let's build a bigger barn. And then he builds a bigger barn, and he tells himself that everything is okay. And then he dies, like, instantly. And like basically the message of the story is like, you can have everything and you can tell yourself that everything will be okay, and then you could just lose it all in an instant and you will have gained nothing, which you said was more pertained to one day. But I don't know, that parable came to my head.
No, I think actually you tied it in quite well to what I was saying, because there's this part of the story where basically he writes her this really, okay, I have to preface this, because if you've only seen the movie or the TV show, this isn't in the movie or the TV show, if I remember correctly. This is only in the book, because in the story after college, he decides to take a gap year, and between going to work, basically. And so he ends up on this trip to India. And while he's there, he keeps in contact with Emma, and they've been writing these letters back and forth to each other the whole time. And so he has been writing her these kind of short postcard notes, because he's like really busy and into himself and having a great time. So he'll write her and be like, oh, I'm having so much fun, period, and then just send it in the mail. And he doesn't really sit around and wait for them, but whenever they arrive, she gets really excited, and she's really touched that he even takes the time to write her. Whereas she writes these like really long letters to him, like 2 to 3 page letters, basically. And he always sits down and enjoys reading them and everything, but they're basically filled with complaints of how her life is going nowhere, and she's hates the place that she's working, and she's trying to figure out what to do with her life, because she kind of got a kind of worthless degree for actually doing something meaningful. I think she did something like English or something, or history. And, obviously, as somebody who loves the humanities, I fully value that. But unless you have a very specific idea of what you want to do with that on a college level, you should probably minor in it and go into something a little bit more practical. In the story, he finally sits down to write her a long letter, and he basically writes her this long, life-changing letter that basically detailed not his love for her, because they weren't really in love with each other yet. That kind of grows as the story goes along, and it's kind of an on and off thing a bit, but it's more of something where he really admires and respects her and thinks she's just absolutely brilliant and that she's wasting her life. And so he basically tells her in this letter to quit her job and to come to India with him. And they're just going to go travel for the next year and figure out what they want to do with their lives together, basically. And it's this great letter. I mean, it's a total, meet me. He says, he tells her to meet him at the Taj Mahal on his birthday, and basically they'll figure things out from there, and he's going to pay for it because he's super rich, and his family has money, and they're British, so old money, of course. And it's because it's written by a man, it's not really flowery at all, but it's pretty adventurous, shall we say. Well, he's just convinced that he's brilliant for doing this right, and he decides to go to the bar before he basically goes to deliver the letter, and he gets super drunk, and he has the letter in his copy of a book, and he thinks he's done this great thing. So he goes to celebrate like an idiot, and he leaves the book in the bar and walks out and completely forgets about it. And the letter is lost until it is found by another woman who thinks that it is just so profound and wonderful that she takes it back to the hotel, asks them if they know anybody by the woman's name on the letter because he didn't sign the letter because he forgot to. And basically she ends up taking the book and the letter back to her to Germany, and the main character, the female main character, never gets the letter. And he doesn't even bother trying to write another one for whatever reason, probably because he just forgets he ever had the idea because he got drunk. So to what you were saying about basically that idea of thinking you've worked everything out and then losing everything, in a way, he kind of, this character, Dexter, kind of thinks he has her all figured out and knows exactly how to solve her life, and then kind of just forgets to really do anything about it.
It's similar themes, definitely. I don't know. Maybe we'll have another discussion on this another day. Maybe Carol will jump in with something.
Well, we are going to close off the episode here because I think this has been a very good conversation, and we definitely will do a probably more in-depth sort of look at this topic. But for my first yapping session on the podcast, and for one that we came up with very last minute, I'd say we did pretty well.
I'd say we could give ourselves a nice pat on the back.
So you guys, coming up next on the podcast, in no particular order, we have a episode due on church movements, church history, tradition of the faith, and a staple of the faith. But until then, we wish you guys a wonderful weekend and start to it. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please share it with your family and friends. Leave us more examples that we may have missed in some of the content we went over, or content we just didn't discuss at all in the comments. And now we will end with a closing prayer. Thaddeus, take us away.
All right. Y'all know the prayer, like St. Simeon's prayer. Lord, now let us allow thy servants depart in peace, according to thy word, for our eyes have seen thy salvation, before the face of all people, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of thy people Israel. Amen.
Amen. We'll see you guys next time.
All right. God bless.
Thank you for joining us on the Three Arms podcast, where Carol, Thaddeus Martin, and I, Evelyne Goldsmith, engage in an ecumenical dialogue about current Christian events, theology, exposing heresy, promoting orthodoxy, and striving to bring clarity and unity to the body of Christ. We thank you all for listening to us today and encourage our listeners to continue to join us on this journey. If you've enjoyed our discussion and would like to see us grow, please consider sharing this podcast with your friends and family. By doing so, you can help us reach a wider audience and continue to foster dialogue and understanding within the Christian community and beyond its barriers. Let others know that we are here to provide a space where Christians can come together, share their thoughts, and engage in meaningful discussions. Together, we can contribute to the reunifying and expansion of Christendom. Thank you once again for joining us on this expedition, and until next time, may God bless you abundantly.